In June 1941, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, marking the largest invasion in history, as the Nazi leadership devises a hunger plan alongside the Commissar Order, transforming the campaign into a systematic war of annihilation. In this episode, we establish the backdrop: Stalin's neutrality pact with Japan from April and his ill-fated cautiousness, Chiang Kai-shek's precarious strategies as China turns toward support from America, and Rudolf Hess's strange solo flight to Britain during the Blitz. Then we focus on the front lines: overlooked intelligence, German deception, and the late-night military buildup that transforms the June 22nd assault into a devastating surprise. You will witness the Luftwaffe devastate Soviet airfields, how Minsk and Smolensk are encircled, the reasons Kiev is held for too long, and the initiation of the siege of Leningrad. We will follow the disarray of the Red Army and their determined counterattacks, the frantic relocation of factories eastward, the emergence of partisan warfare, and the parallel terror of NKVD atrocities and the Holocaust by bullets executed by Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators. Expect a clear, step-by-step examination of decisions made in Berlin and Moscow, the logistics and ideology behind these choices, and how, within a few months of 1941, the war in the East spirals into a catastrophe for both soldiers and civilians. In the spring of 1941, as Hitler's invasion of Yugoslavia led to swift success, Stalin adopted a strategy of caution. On April 13th, the Soviet Union entered a 5-year neutrality agreement with Japan, acknowledging the puppet regime of Manchukuo. This was the culmination of Chiang Kai-shek's concerns since the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In 1940, Chiang had attempted a delicate maneuver, reaching out to Japan with peace overtures, hoping to compel the Soviet Union to restore its significantly reduced support and thwart its ties with Tokyo. However, he understood that any actual agreement with the Japanese would shift leadership of the Chinese population to Mao and the Communists, perceived as a grave betrayal. Following Japan's signing of the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, both Chiang and Stalin recognized the heightened possibility of Japan engaging the United States, an idea that greatly encouraged him. The survival of China now rested with the United States, even as Chiang anticipated that the Soviet Union would also ultimately join an anti-fascist coalition. He foresaw a world that was about to become more distinctly polarized. The three-dimensional game of chess would eventually be reduced to 2 dimensions. Both the Soviet Union and Japan, nations that despised each other, sought to protect their own interests. In April 1941, following the signing of a neutrality pact, Joseph Stalin made an appearance at the Yaroslavsky railway station in Moscow to bid farewell to Matsuoka Yosuke, the Japanese foreign minister, who was still under the influence of Stalin's lavish hospitality. Amidst the throng on the platform, Stalin unexpectedly spotted Oberst Hans Krebs, the German military attaché who would later become the last chief of the General Staff in 1945. To the astonishment of the German officer, Stalin patted him on the back and remarked, "We must always stay friends, whatever happens." This display of friendliness contrasted sharply with Stalin's frail and unhealthy appearance. "I'm convinced of it," Krebs replied, still recovering from his surprise, though he found it hard to believe that Stalin had not yet figured out Germany's plans for invasion. Adolf Hitler was confidently resolute. He chose to disregard Otto von Bismarck's caution against invading Russia and the well-known risks of fighting on 2 fronts. He rationalized his long-standing goal of dismantling what he termed Jewish Bolshevism as the best approach to force Britain to agree to terms. Once the Soviet Union was defeated, Japan would then have the opportunity to shift American attention to the Pacific and away from Europe. However, the main focus of the Nazi leadership was to gain control of the Soviet Union's oil and food resources, which they believed would render them unstoppable. Under the Hunger Plan, created by Staatssekretär Herbert Backe, the Wehrmacht's takeover of Soviet food production was intended to result in the deaths of 30 million people, predominantly in urban areas. Hitler, Hermann Göring, and Heinrich Himmler embraced Backe's radical plan with zeal, as it appeared to provide both a significant solution to Germany's escalating food crisis and a powerful tool in their ideological battle against Slavs and Jewish Bolshevism. The Wehrmacht also supported this strategy. By sourcing food for its 3 million soldiers and 600,000 horses locally, the challenges of supplying forces over vast distances with inadequate rail transport would be significantly mitigated. It was clear that Soviet prisoners of war would also face systematic starvation according to the plan. Thus, the Wehrmacht became an active participant in a genocidal war of annihilation even before the first shots were fired. On May 4, 1941, surrounded by his deputy Rudolf Hess and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag. He announced that the National Socialist state would endure for 1,000 years. Just 6 nights later, Rudolf Hess unexpectedly took flight in a Messerschmitt 110, heading toward Scotland under the brightness of a full moon. He parachuted out but suffered a broken ankle upon landing. Influenced by astrologers, he believed he could negotiate peace with Britain. Despite his evident mental instability, Hess, like Joachim von Ribbentrop, sensed that an invasion of the Soviet Union could lead to disaster. Yet, his self-styled peace mission was destined for failure. His arrival in Britain coincided with one of the most intense bombing raids during the Blitz. The Luftwaffe, taking advantage of the bright night, targeted Hull and London, inflicting damage on Westminster Abbey, the House of Commons, the British Museum, countless hospitals, the City of London, the Tower of London, and the docks. Incendiary bombs ignited over 2,000 major fires. This wave of raids raised the civilian death toll to 40,000, with another 46,000 severely injured. Hess's strange mission resulted in embarrassment for the British government, confusion in Germany, and deep-seated distrust in Moscow. The British leadership mishandled the situation entirely. They should have swiftly declared that Hitler had attempted a peace offer, which had been firmly rejected. Instead, Joseph Stalin became convinced that Hess's plane had been directed by the British Secret Intelligence Service. He had long harbored suspicions that Winston Churchill was trying to bait Hitler into attacking the Soviet Union. Now, he began to question whether Churchill was secretly colluding with Germany. Stalin had already dismissed all British warnings regarding German plans to invade the Soviet Union as mere British provocations. Even detailed reports from his own intelligence services were angrily dismissed, often based on the belief that officers stationed abroad had been compromised by foreign influences. Stalin continued to believe Hitler's assurance, given in a letter at the beginning of the year, that German forces were being relocated eastward solely to evade British bombings. Lieutenant General Philip Ivanovich Golikov, the inexperienced head of military intelligence for the GRU, was equally convinced that Hitler would not launch an attack on the Soviet Union until Britain had been conquered. Golikov declined to share any intelligence regarding German intentions with Zhukov, the head of the General Staff, or with Timoshenko, who had taken over as the Commissar of Defense from Voroshilov. However, both men were fully aware of the increasing strength of the German military and had created a contingency plan dated May 15th, which discussed a potential preemptive strike to disrupt German preparations. Additionally, Joseph Stalin had approved a significant increase in forces as a precaution, which included calling up 800,000 reservists and deploying nearly 30 divisions along the western borders of the Soviet Union. Some revisionist historians have attempted to argue that these measures signified a genuine intention to launch an attack on Germany, suggesting a justification for Adolf Hitler's later invasion. In reality, the Red Army was not prepared to embark on a major offensive in the summer of 1941, and it is important to note that Hitler had made the decision to invade much earlier. Nonetheless, it is possible that Stalin, deeply concerned by France's swift defeat, was contemplating a preemptive strike in the winter of 1941, or more likely in 1942, when the Red Army would be more adequately trained and equipped. Increasing intelligence reports were confirming the threat of a German invasion. Stalin dismissed the information gathered by Richard Sorge at the German embassy in Tokyo, who was his most effective agent. In Berlin, the Soviet military attaché learned that 140 German divisions were now stationed along the Soviet Union's borders. The Soviet embassy in Berlin even secured evidence of a Russian phrasebook intended for troops including phrases like, "Hands up, are you a communist? Are you a communist? I will shoot," and "Where is the collective farm chairman?" The most surprising alert came from the German ambassador in Moscow, Graf Friedrich von der Schulenburg, an anti-Nazi who was later executed for his involvement in the plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944. When Stalin received this warning, he reacted with disbelief, exclaiming that disinformation has now reached ambassadorial level. In a denial-fueled state, the Soviet leader convinced himself that the Germans were merely trying to pressure him into conceding more in a new agreement. Ironically, Schulenburg's straightforwardness was a rare exception in the carefully crafted deception of German diplomacy. Even the loathed Joachim von Ribbentrop cleverly manipulated Stalin's distrust of Winston Churchill, leading to a counterproductive response from the Soviet leader regarding British alerts about Operation Barbarossa. Stalin had been informed about the Allied plans to bomb the oil fields in Baku during the conflict with Finland. The Soviet occupation of Bessarabia in June 1940, which Ribbentrop had convinced King Carol to accept, effectively pushed Romania directly into Hitler's opportunistic hands. Stalin's attempts to appease Hitler continued with a significant increase in shipments to Germany of grain, fuel, cotton, metals, and rubber sourced from Southeast Asia, bypassing the British blockade. During the time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union supplied the Reich with 26,000 tons of chromium for metal alloys, 140,000 tons of manganese, and more than 2 million tons of oil. Even with over 80 clear warnings of a German invasion, possibly more than 100, Stalin seemed primarily focused on the security issue along our northwest frontier, concerning the Baltic states. On the night of June 14th, shortly before the German invasion, 60,000 Estonians, 34,000 Latvians, and 38,000 Lithuanians were loaded onto cattle trucks for deportation to camps deep within the Soviet Union. Even as the last week before the invasion unfolded, with German ships hastily departing Soviet ports and embassy staff being evacuated, Stalin remained unconvinced. On March 30th, Hitler had informed his generals, "This is a war of extermination. Commanders must be prepared to set aside their personal scruples." The primary concern among senior officers was the impact on discipline. Their deep-seated instincts, anti-Slav, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic, aligned with Nazi beliefs, despite many harboring a dislike for the party and its officials. They were told that famine would be used as a weapon, leading to an estimated 30 million Soviet citizens facing starvation. This would reduce the population sufficiently, leaving just enough to serve as slaves in a German-colonized Garden of Eden. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum appeared closer than ever. On June 6th, the Wehrmacht issued its infamous Commissar Order, explicitly rejecting any adherence to international law. This directive stated that Soviet political officers, card-carrying communists, saboteurs, and male Jews were to be executed as partisans. On the night of June 20th, the High Command issued the code word Dortmund, noting in its war diary that the attack was definitively scheduled for June 22nd, and the order was to be communicated to the army groups. Hitler, eager for the pivotal moment, readied himself to depart for his new headquarters near Rostenburg, known as the Wolf's Lair. He firmly believed that the Red Army and the entire Soviet system would crumble. He had told his commanders, "We just need to kick in the door and the whole decaying structure will come tumbling down." However, some more thoughtful officers stationed on the eastern borders held private doubts. Many revisited General Armand de Caulaincourt's narrative of Napoleon's advance on Moscow and the harrowing retreat that followed. Older officers and soldiers who had fought in Russia during the First World War felt anxious. Nevertheless, the series of resounding victories by the Wehrmacht in Poland, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France, and the Balkans had convinced most Germans of their forces' invincibility. Officers assured their troops that they were on the brink of the largest offensive ever launched. Nearly 3 million German soldiers, soon to be bolstered by forces from Finland, Romania, Hungary, and eventually Italy, were set to battle Bolshevism. In the dense forests of birch and fir, which hid supply parks, makeshift headquarters, signal units, and combat troops, officers prepared their men. Many calmed their nerves by claiming it would take only 3 or 4 weeks to defeat the Red Army. A soldier in a mountain division expressed relief, saying, "Early tomorrow morning, we set out, thanks be to God, against our mortal enemy Bolshevism. A real weight has lifted from my heart. The uncertainty is over, and I finally know where I stand. I am very optimistic. If we can secure all the land and raw materials up to the Ural Mountains, then Europe will sustain itself, and the naval war may drag on as long as it needs to." A signals non-commissioned officer in the SS Division Das Reich was even more assured. "I believe the destruction of Russia will take no longer than that of France, and my hope for leave in August still stands." Around midnight on this Midsummer's Eve, the first units advanced to their attack positions, while the last goods train carrying Soviet deliveries passed them en route to Germany. The dark shapes of tanks in formation released clouds of exhaust as their engines roared to life. Artillery units removed camouflage netting from their guns and towed them into position near concealed stockpiles of shells ready for firing. Along the western bank of the River Bug, heavy rubber assault boats were pulled up to the marshy edge, while men spoke in hushed tones, careful not to attract the attention of the NKVD border guards across the water. In front of the formidable fortress of Brest-Litovsk, sand had been scattered on the roads to muffle the sound of their heavy boots. It was a cool and clear morning, with dew glittering on the meadows. Thoughts of wives, children, sweethearts, and parents back home in Germany, all peacefully asleep and unaware of the vast operation ahead, filled the men's minds. That evening, in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin's anxiety grew. The deputy chief of the NKVD had just reported a troubling 39 aircraft incursions over the Soviet border the previous day. When informed about a German deserter, a former communist who had crossed the lines to warn of the impending attack, Stalin swiftly ordered him to be executed for spreading disinformation. He only agreed to allow his increasingly anxious generals to put the anti-aircraft defenses around Moscow on alert and to issue a precautionary order to the frontline commanders to be ready, but refrain from firing back. Stalin clung to the belief that any aggression was not instigated by Adolf Hitler, but rather a provocation by German military leaders. That night, he retreated to bed unusually early in his dacha, just outside Moscow. Georgy Zhukov called at 4:45 in the morning, insisting he be awakened. Reports of a German bombing raid on the Soviet naval base in Sebastopol and other attacks had come in. Stalin remained silent for a long moment, breathing heavily, before instructing Zhukov that the troops were not to respond with artillery fire. Zhukov was to call a meeting of the Politburo. When they gathered in the Kremlin at 5:45 in the morning, Stalin still refused to accept that Hitler had any knowledge of the attack. Vyacheslav Molotov was asked to summon Franz von Schulenburg, who informed him that a state of war now existed between Germany and the Soviet Union. After his earlier warning, Schulenburg was taken aback by the shock this announcement caused. A visibly shaken Molotov returned to the meeting to relay the news to Stalin, prompting a heavy silence. In the early hours of June 22, along the stretch of Eastern Europe from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, tens of thousands of German officers began checking their synchronized watches using the light of shaded torches. Right on schedule, they heard the roar of aircraft engines approaching from behind. The waiting soldiers gazed up at the night sky as groups of German Luftwaffe planes flew overhead, heading toward the first light of dawn on the expansive eastern horizon. At 15 minutes past 3 in the morning, German time, a heavy artillery bombardment began. On this very first day of the war between the Soviet Union and Germany, the German armed forces easily broke through the border defenses along an 1,800-kilometer front. Border guards were taken by surprise, even caught in their underwear, while their families faced artillery strikes in their barracks. The war diary of the German High Command noted that by morning it became clear that surprise had been achieved across all sectors. Army headquarters reported that all bridges within their reach had been captured intact. Within hours, the leading tank divisions were overrunning Soviet supply depots. The Red Army was almost entirely unprepared for this assault. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Soviet leader had pushed it to move from the Stalin line behind the old border establishing a forward defense along the border created by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. However, not enough preparations had been made for the new positions, despite General Zhukov's vigorous efforts. Fewer than half of the strongholds were equipped with heavy weapons. Artillery units lacked their tractors, which had been sent to aid in the harvest. Soviet aviation was caught unaware, with aircraft lined up neatly, making easy targets for the Luftwaffe's preemptive strikes on 66 airfields. Approximately 1,800 fighters and bombers were reported destroyed on the first day of the attack, mostly while grounded. The Luftwaffe sustained losses of only 35 aircraft. Even after Hitler's rapid campaigns in Poland and France, the Soviets had planned for a defense that anticipated 10 to 15 days before the main forces engaged. Stalin's decision to remain unresponsive, combined with the ruthless tactics of the German armed forces, left them with no time at all. Commandos from the German Regiment 800 infiltrated ahead of the attack or parachuted in to secure bridges and cut communication lines. In the southern region, Ukrainian nationalists were also sent to create chaos and incite uprisings against their Soviet rulers. Consequently, Soviet commanders were left in the dark, unable to determine what was happening, and incapable of issuing commands or reaching their superiors. From the East Prussian border, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North launched an offensive into the Baltic states, aiming for Leningrad. Their progress was significantly supported by Brandenburgers in brown Soviet uniforms who captured twin rail and road bridges over the River Dwina on June 26. General Lieutenant von Manstein's LVI Panzer Corps, progressing nearly 80 kilometers a day, reached the halfway point to their goal in just 5 days. He later described this swift advance as the realization of a tank commander's dream. North of the Pripyat marshes, Army Group Center, under General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock, pressed quickly into Belarusia, soon engaging in a major encirclement battle around Minsk alongside the panzer groups led by Guderian and Generaloberst Hermann Hoth. The only significant resistance encountered was from the vast fortress of Brest-Litovsk on the border. The Austrian 45th Infantry Division faced severe losses, far exceeding those sustained during the campaign in France, as its assault teams attempted to flush out the determined defenders using flamethrowers, tear gas, and grenades. These defenders, enduring extreme thirst and lacking medical supplies, continued to resist for 3 weeks until they were either wounded or out of ammunition. However, upon their return in 1945 from German captivity, their remarkable bravery did not prevent them from being sent to the Gulag, as Stalin decreed that surrender was traitorous to the motherland. Frontier guards from the NKVD forces also resisted fiercely when not caught off guard. Yet too frequently, Red Army officers abandoned their troops, fleeing in terror. With their communications in disarray, commanders found themselves immobilized by a lack of directives or by counterattack orders that did not reflect the realities on the battlefield. The purging of the Red Army had placed inexperienced officers in charge of entire divisions and army corps, while the fear of denunciation and arrest by the NKVD stifled any initiative. Even the most courageous commander would likely be gripped by fear upon the arrival of officers wearing the green tabs and cap band of the NKVD at his headquarters. The difference with the German Army's system of Auftragstaktik, where junior commanders were assigned a task and then trusted to execute it as they saw fit, could not have been more pronounced. Army Group South, led by General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt, advanced into Ukraine. Rundstedt soon received support from 2 Romanian armies eager to reclaim Bessarabia from the Soviets. Their leader, Marshal Ion Antonescu, had assured Hitler just 10 days earlier, "Of course I will be there from the start. When it comes to action against the Slavs, you can always rely on Romania." Stalin, having prepared a speech announcing the invasion, instructed Molotov to broadcast it on Soviet radio at noon. The announcement reverberated over loudspeakers for the masses in the streets. Despite Molotov's flat delivery, he concluded with, "Our cause is just, the enemy will be crushed, and victory will be ours." Even with his lackluster tone, the populace was filled with outrage over this breach of their homeland. Long lines of volunteers quickly formed at recruitment centers, while other, more chaotic lines emerged, as people rushed to purchase canned and dried goods and withdraw their money from banks. There was also a peculiar sense of relief that this treacherous assault had freed the Soviet Union from its unnatural alliance with Nazi Germany. The young physicist Andrei Sakharov was later embraced by an aunt in a bomb shelter during a Luftwaffe raid over Moscow, who remarked, "For the first time in years, I feel like a Russian again." Similar sentiments of relief echoed in Berlin, where people felt they were finally confronting the real enemy. The fighter regiments of the Red Army, comprised of inexperienced pilots flying outdated aircraft, stood little chance against the Luftwaffe. German fighter aces quickly racked up impressive tallies, calling their easy targets infanticide. Their Soviet adversaries felt psychologically defeated even before meeting their foes. However, even as many pilots shied away from battle, a deep desire for vengeance began to kindle. A few of the bravest chose to ram German aircraft at any opportunity, fully aware they had little chance of pursuing the enemy to shoot it down. The novelist and war correspondent Vasily Grossman recounted waiting for the planes of a fighter regiment to return to an airfield near Gomel in Belarusia. Finally, after a successful assault on a German column, the fighters returned and landed. The commander's aircraft had human flesh lodged in the radiator. That was due to supporting aircraft hitting a truck loaded with ammunition that exploded at the exact moment when the commander flew over it. Pop, the commander, is picking out the remains with a file. A doctor is called in to closely examine the bloody remains and declares it Aryan meat. Laughter erupts in response. Indeed, a merciless era has arrived. A German soldier remarked on the resilience of the Russian forces, noting that very few prisoners are taken. Instead, they are executed. While advancing, some soldiers casually fired at groups of Red Army captives being driven to makeshift camps, where they were left to starve, exposed to the elements. Although some German officers were horrified, most were more preoccupied with the issues of discipline within their ranks. On the Soviet side, Beria's secret police executed numerous prisoners in proximity to the front lines to prevent them from being liberated by the German advance, resulting in the deaths of nearly 10,000 Polish captives. In Lwów, around 4,000 people were killed by the secret police. By late June, the stench of decaying bodies filled the air of the entire city. In response to the massacre, Ukrainian nationalists initiated a guerrilla war against the Soviet forces. In a surge of panic and animosity, the secret police executed an additional 10,000 prisoners in Bessarabia and the Baltic regions, which had been captured the year prior. Other prisoners were marched east, with guards shooting anyone who fell behind. On June 23rd, Joseph Stalin established a Supreme Command headquarters, reviving the old Tsarist term, Stavka. Shortly thereafter, he arrived at the Defense Commissariat, accompanied by Beria and Molotov. There, they found Timoshenko and Zhukov struggling to impose some semblance of order along the vast front. With the fall of Minsk, Stalin examined the situation maps and read several reports. He was visibly disturbed to discover that the circumstances were even more dire than he had anticipated. Angrily, he lashed out at Timoshenko and Zhukov, who did not hesitate to respond in kind. It was heard he lamented, "Lenin built our state, and we have ruined it." Stalin then retreated to his dacha at Kuntsevo, leaving the Politburo members in confusion. Whispers suggested that Molotov should assume leadership, but they were too intimidated to confront the dictator. On June 30th, they resolved to establish a state committee for defense with sweeping authority. They made their way to Kuntsevo to meet with Stalin. Upon entering, he appeared fatigued and apprehensive, as if he feared they were there to arrest him. He inquired about their purpose, and when they explained the need for him to head this emergency war cabinet, his surprise was evident, but he consented to accept the position. Some have proposed that Stalin's absence from the Kremlin was a strategic move reminiscent of Ivan the Terrible, aimed at exposing any dissenters within the Politburo so he could eliminate them. However, this remains purely speculative. Stalin returned to the Kremlin the following day, July 1st. Just 2 days later, he addressed the Soviet people in his own broadcast. Displaying his keen instincts, he surprised his audience by referring to them as comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters. This kind of familial language was unprecedented among Kremlin leaders. He urged them to defend the motherland through a rigorous policy of total warfare, drawing parallels to the historic struggle against Napoleon. Stalin recognized that the people were far more willing to sacrifice their lives for their nation than for any communist beliefs. He understood that war could rekindle their sense of patriotism. While he did not shy away from the seriousness of the circumstances, he conveniently overlooked his role in the disaster. He also called for the establishment of a people's levy, known as Narodno Opolkenie. These militia units, poorly equipped, were expected to delay the advance of the German tanks using their own bodies. The immense suffering of civilians caught in the conflict was not part of Stalin's calculations. Refugees, herding cattle from collective farms, desperately tried to stay ahead of the advancing panzer divisions. On June 26th, the writer Alexander Tvardovsky witnessed a startling scene through his train window during a stop in Ukraine. He documented in his diary that the entire field was filled with people lying down, sitting, and moving around. They carried bundles, knapsacks, suitcases, children, and handcarts. It was an unprecedented sight of so many household items that people were taking with them as they fled in haste. There were likely tens of thousands in that field. The crowd began to surge towards the railway and the train, banging on the walls and windows of the carriages, almost tipping the train off its tracks. As the train started to move, hundreds, if not thousands, lost their lives in the bombings of the cities in Belarus. Those who survived had little luck as they attempted to flee eastward. Following the burning of Minsk, a journalist reported seeing blind men from an invalid home walking along the highway in a long line, tied together with towels. There were already many war orphans, children whose parents had been killed or were missing in the chaos. The NKVD, suspecting that some of these children might be used as spies by the Germans, showed them little compassion. After their remarkable success in France, the panzer formations charged forward in the ideal summer weather, while the infantry divisions struggled to keep pace. Occasionally, when the tank advance ran low on ammunition, Heinkel 111 bombers had to be redirected to drop supplies by parachute. The paths of advance were marked by burning villages, clouds of dust stirred up by vehicles, and the steady movement of marching infantry along with their horse-drawn artillery. Gunners sitting on limbers were covered in a fine layer of dust, giving them the appearance of terracotta figures, while their laboring draft animals coughed in a weary rhythm. More than 600,000 horses, gathered from across Europe, just like in Napoleon's Grande Armée, served as the backbone of transport for the Wehrmacht during the campaign. Rations, ammunition, and even field ambulances relied on horsepower. If not for the large amount of motor transport that the French army had failed to destroy before the armistice, an issue that stirred bitter anger in Stalin, the mechanization of the German army would have been restricted mostly to the 4 panzer groups. The 2 major panzer formations of Army Group Center had already executed their first significant encirclement, trapping 4 Soviet armies with 417,000 men in the Bialystok pocket west of Minsk. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group on the northern side of the encirclement and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group on the southern side met on June 28th. The bombers and Stukas of the 2nd Luftflotte then bombarded the encircled Red Army forces. This advance indicated that Army Group Center was progressing well toward the land bridge between the Dwina River, which leads to the Baltic Sea, and the Dnieper River, which flows down to the Black Sea. General Dmitry Pavlov, who had been the Soviet tank commander during the Spanish Civil War and was now the unfortunate leader of the Western Front, was replaced by Marshal Timoshenko. Pavlov, along with other senior officers from his command, was quickly arrested, tried, and executed by the NKVD. Several desperate, high-ranking officers took their own lives, one notably shooting himself in front of Nikita Khrushchev, the official responsible for Ukraine. In the north, Lieb's army group received a warm welcome in the Baltic states following the harsh Soviet oppression and deportations just a week prior. Nationalist groups launched attacks against the retreating Soviet forces and seized control of towns. The NKVD's 5th Motorized Rifle Regiment was dispatched to Riga to restore order, which involved immediate reprisals against the Latvian people. Before the bodies of our fallen comrades, The regiment's personnel vowed to ruthlessly crush the fascist foes, and on the very same day, the bourgeoisie of Riga knew our retribution. However, they too were soon compelled to retreat along the Baltic coast. North of Kaunas in Lithuania, a Soviet mechanized corps launched a surprise counterattack against the advancing Germans, employing heavy KV tanks. Panzer shells simply bounced off these tanks, and they could only be dealt with after 88mm guns were brought in. The Soviet Northwestern Front retreated into Estonia, pursued by makeshift nationalist forces that neither the Red Army nor the Germans had anticipated. Just before the Germans arrived, horrific pogroms erupted against the Jewish population, who were blamed for collaborating with the Bolsheviks. Rundstedt's Army Group South faced a less favorable situation. Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos, who led the Southwestern Front, had been alerted by NKVD border guards about the impending attack. He also had stronger military forces, as Timoshenko and Zhukov had anticipated this area would face the main assault. Kirponos was instructed to initiate a significant counterattack with 5 mechanized corps. The most formidable of these, equipped with heavy KV tanks and the new T-34s, was under the command of Major General Andrei Vlasov. However, Kirponos struggled to deploy his forces effectively due to disrupted communications and widely dispersed formations. On June 26, General der Kavallerie von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group moved towards Rovno, aiming for Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Kirponos committed 5 of his mechanized corps with varied results. The Germans were taken aback to discover that the T-34s and heavy KV tanks outmatched anything they possessed. Yet, even the People's Commissar for Defense had noted Soviet tank gunnery as insufficient on the eve of war, highlighting that out of 14,000 Soviet tanks, only 3,800 were combat-ready on June 22nd. The training, strategies, communication systems, and rapid response of the German Army's panzer crews proved to be overwhelmingly superior. Additionally, they benefited from robust support from Stuka squadrons. Their major threat was overconfidence. Major General Konstantin Rokossovski, a former cavalry officer of Polish descent who emerged as one of the war's notable commanders, successfully lured the 13th Panzer Division into an artillery trap after his outdated tanks had suffered heavy losses the previous day. Confronted with ongoing panic and widespread desertions, Kirponos implemented blocking detachments to compel soldiers to return to the fight. Wild rumors spread chaos, reminiscent of the situation in France. Although the Soviet counteroffensives were costly and proved unsuccessful, they did succeed in slowing the German advance. Nikita Khrushchev had already begun, under Stalin's directive, a significant operation to evacuate machinery from Ukraine's factories and workshops. This operation was executed with ruthless efficiency, transporting the majority of the republic's industrial capabilities by train to the Urals and further east. Smaller-scale evacuations were also conducted in Belarus and other areas. In total, 2,593 industrial units were relocated over the year. This would eventually enable the Soviet Union to resume arms production beyond the reach of German bombers. The Politburo also made the decision to secretly transport Lenin's preserved body, as well as the nation's gold reserves and Tsarist valuables, from Moscow to Tyumen in western Siberia. A special train carrying necessary chemicals and scientists to maintain the body's preservation left early in July, accompanied by NKVD guards. On July 3rd, General Halder recorded in his diary that it was likely true to say the Russian campaign had been won in just 2 weeks. However, he admitted that the vastness of the country and ongoing resistance would keep the invading forces engaged for many more weeks. Meanwhile, in Germany, an SS survey on public sentiment revealed that people were speculating on how soon the war would conclude. Some convinced themselves that their armies were already within 100 kilometers of Moscow, but Goebbels worked to temper such beliefs. He wanted to ensure their victory was not shadowed by the notion that it had taken longer than anticipated. The vastness of the land that the German army had invaded, with its endless views, began to affect the ordinary soldiers, known as Landser. Those from mountainous regions felt particularly disheartened by the flatness that seemed like an endless sea of land. Frontline units soon realized that, unlike in France, Groups of Soviet soldiers would continue to fight even after being bypassed. They would suddenly open fire from hidden spots in the massive cornfields and target reinforcements or command posts moving forward. Any soldier captured was executed as a partisan. Many Soviet civilians also held overly optimistic beliefs. Some convinced themselves that the German working class would rise against their Nazi leaders now that they were invading the motherland of the oppressed. Those who hung maps to chart the achievements of the Red Army soon had to take them down, as it became evident how far the German army had penetrated Soviet territory. However, the initial triumph of the German forces soon began to fade. The significant encirclement battles, particularly at Smolensk, became increasingly difficult. The armored units executed their sweeping movements with ease, but they lacked enough infantry to secure the vast circle against threats from both inside and outside. Many Soviet troops managed to escape before the weary German infantry caught up, exhausted from forced marches of up to 50 kilometers a day while carrying full equipment. The trapped Red Army soldiers refused to surrender. They fought fiercely, even if their determination was often coerced by officers and political leaders at gunpoint. Running low on ammunition, large numbers of soldiers surged forward, trying to break through the encirclement. Some charged forward with their arms linked, while German machine gunners cut them down, their weapons overheating from relentless firing. The cries of the wounded echoed for hours, wearing on the nerves of the weary German troops. On July 9th, Vitebsk fell. Like Minsk, Smolensk, and later Gomel and Chernigov, it became a raging inferno of burning wooden buildings from Luftwaffe bombings. The flames were so fierce that many German soldiers in their vehicles felt forced to retreat. A total of 32 German divisions were required to reduce the Smolensk cauldron. The Kesselschlacht, or Cauldron Battle, continued until August 11th. The Soviet forces experienced 300,000 irrecoverable losses, which included men killed or captured, in addition to 3,200 tanks and 3,100 artillery pieces. However, counterattacks from the east facilitated the escape of over 100,000 men, and the halt in the German advance proved to be crucial. Vasily Grossman visited a field hospital where around 900 wounded soldiers lay in a small clearing surrounded by young aspens. There were blood-stained rags, pieces of flesh, groans, and muffled cries, all accompanied by countless sorrowful eyes. The young red-haired doctor had lost her voice after operating all night, her face pale as if she might faint at any moment. She shared with a smile that she had operated on his friend, the poet Iosef Utkin. While I was making incisions, he recited poetry for me, she recalled in a barely audible voice, using gestures to help convey her words. More injured men kept arriving, drenched in blood and rain. Despite their significant advances and signs pointing toward Moscow, the German army on the Eastern Front began to doubt whether they would secure victory that year. The three army groups reported 213,000 casualties. Although this figure may have represented just a fraction of the Soviet losses, if the attritional battle persisted much longer, the German army would struggle to defend its stretched supply lines and defeat the remaining Soviet forces. The thought of fighting through a Russian winter was particularly alarming. The Germans had not succeeded in destroying the Red Army in the Western Soviet Union, and the expansive Eurasian landmass loomed before them. The front line, which had stretched to 1,500 kilometers, was now reaching 2,500 kilometers. Assessments of Soviet strength from Army intelligence soon appeared grossly underestimated. General Halder noted on August 11th, "At the beginning of the war, we estimated around 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. The fact that a Soviet division might be noticeably weaker than a German one offered little comfort. If we defeat a dozen of them, the Russians simply send up another dozen. For the Russian populace, the prospect of German forces advancing along Napoleon's route to Moscow was deeply unsettling. Still, Stalin's directive to initiate large counteroffensives westward towards Smolensk had a significant impact, despite the staggering cost in lives and equipment. The shift in strategy played a crucial role in Hitler's decision to have Army Group Center adopt a defensive posture, while Army Group North moved toward Leningrad and Army Group South advanced toward Kiev. The 3rd Panzer Group was redirected to Leningrad. According to Generalleutnant Alfred Jodl from the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, Hitler aimed to avoid repeating Napoleon's errors. General Feldmarschall von Bock, along with other high-ranking officers, was shocked by this change, as they believed that Moscow, the hub of Soviet communications, should still be the main target. However, several generals argued that it was essential to eliminate the vast Soviet forces around Kiev before launching an assault on Moscow, to prevent any potential attacks on their southern flank. On July 29th, Georgy Zhukov warned Joseph Stalin about the risk of encircling Kiev and advised abandoning the city. Stalin dismissed Zhukov's concerns, calling them nonsensical. Frustrated, Zhukov asked to be relieved from his post as chief of staff. Instead, Stalin appointed him to lead the reserve front, while keeping him involved with the Stavka. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was tasked with executing a surprise maneuver from the Roslavo salient and advancing 400 kilometers south to Lokvitsa, where he was to link up with Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, which was starting to encircle Kiev from the south. Guderian's rapid advance created disarray among the Soviets. The city of Gomel, the last significant city in Belarusia, had to be quickly evacuated. Despite being reinforced on Stalin's orders, Kirponos's southwestern front was still not allowed to abandon Kiev. Vasily Grossman was fleeing into Ukraine and narrowly avoided capture by Guderian's armored divisions during their southern drive. Amid the invasion's chaos, some Russians initially mistook Guderian for an ally because his name sounded Armenian. Unlike many Soviet war correspondents, Grossman was profoundly affected by the plight of civilians. He noted that whether they were traveling or standing by their fences, they would start to cry as soon as they spoke, evoking a compelling urge to cry along with them. There was so much sorrow. He criticized the hollow propaganda of other journalists who never ventured close to the front lines and used dishonest cliches like, "The battered enemy continued his cowardly advance." Rundstedt's Army Group South had already taken 107,000 prisoners near Uman in Ukraine by August 10th. Stalin commanded the execution of the Red Army generals who had surrendered. He underestimated the danger posed by Guderian's advance to the south and continued to prevent Kirponos from pulling back from the Dnieper line. As part of the scorched earth policy, the immense dam and hydroelectric plant at Zaporozhye, a significant emblem of Soviet achievement, was destroyed. The evacuation of civilians, livestock, and equipment ramped up dramatically. Grossman captured the scene. At night, the sky appeared red from numerous distant fires, with a gray haze of smoke lingering on the horizon during the day. Women cradled children, while old men and herds of sheep, cows, and collective farm horses struggled through the dust on the rural roads, moving east by cart and on foot. Tractor drivers operated their rattling machines. Trains transporting factory machinery, engines, and boilers headed east around the clock. On September 16th, Guderian's and Kleist's panzer groups encountered one another at Lokvitsa, encircling over 700,000 troops. Kirponos, along with many of his staff officers and about 2,000 men, was annihilated by the 3rd Panzer Division nearby. General Feldmarschall von Reichenau's 6th Army advanced into the heavily bombed remnants of Kiev, leaving the civilian population behind in peril of starvation. The Jewish community faced a swifter execution by firing squad. Further south, the 11th Army and the 4th Romanian Army pressed toward Odessa. Army Group South's next targets would be the Crimea, particularly the major naval base of Sebastopol and Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the Caucasus. The Battle of Kiev became the largest encirclement in military history, invigorating German morale once again and making the conquest of Moscow seem attainable. To the relief of Halder, Hitler had already embraced this notion. On September 6th, he issued Führer Directive No. 35, allowing the push toward Moscow. Then, on September 16th, the same day the panzer groups met at Lokvitsa, General Feldmarschall von Bock released preliminary orders for Operation Typhoon. Lieb's army group, having advanced swiftly through the Baltic states, faced increasing resistance as it approached Leningrad. In mid-July, a counteroffensive led by Lieutenant General Nikolai Vatutin surprised the Germans near Lake Ilmen. Even with the backing of Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, Lieb's progress slowed as they navigated the challenging birch forests, lakes, and mosquito-infested marshes. 500,000 individuals from the besieged city were mobilized to construct 1,000 kilometers of fortifications and 645 kilometers of anti-tank ditches. On August 8th, Adolf Hitler instructed General Lieb to encircle Leningrad, while the Finnish forces regained their territory on either side of Lake Ladoga. The poorly trained and barely armed People's Livy was thrown into desperate and deadly assaults, effectively serving as meat for the cannon. In total, over 135,000 citizens of Leningrad, including factory workers and professors, volunteered or were coerced into service. They were deprived of training, medical care, uniforms, transportation, and proper supply lines. More than half of them had no rifles, yet they were still commanded to launch counterattacks against German armored divisions. Most of them fled in fear of the tanks, which they had no means to combat. This immense loss of life, perhaps around 70,000, was tragically pointless, and it is uncertain whether their sacrifices even slowed the German advance along the river Luga. The Soviet 34th Army was devastated. As men deserted, 4,000 faced arrest for being deserters, and nearly half of the wounded were believed to have sustained self-inflicted injuries. In one hospital, 460 out of 1,000 had gunshot wounds to their left hands or forearms. The Estonian capital of Tallinn was cut off by the advancing German forces, yet Joseph Stalin refused to permit the Soviet defenders to evacuate by sea up the Gulf of Finland to Kronstadt. By the time he changed his mind, it was too late for a smooth withdrawal. On August 28th, the ships of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet in Tallinn evacuated 23,000 Soviet citizens as German troops entered the city. Without air cover, the makeshift fleet set out to sea. In total, German mines, Finnish motor torpedo boats, and the Luftwaffe sank 65 vessels, resulting in up to 14,000 deaths. This marked the largest naval disaster in Russian history. To the south of Leningrad, German forces advanced across the main railway line to Moscow. On September 1st, their heavy artillery came within range and began shelling. Soviet army trucks filled with the wounded and a final wave of refugees retreated into Leningrad, with peasants driving overloaded carts and others carrying bundles, while a boy dragged an unwilling goat on a rope as their villages burned in the background. Stalin erupted in fury against Andrei Zhdanov, the Communist Party leader in Leningrad, and Voroshilov, the local defense chief, upon learning of one town after another falling into German hands as they encircled the city from the south. He suggested that traitors were at play. "Doesn't it seem to you that someone is intentionally paving the way for the Germans?" he remarked to Molotov, who was visiting the city to gather information. The incompetence of the Leningrad command is completely baffling. But rather than putting Voroshilov or Zhdanov on trial, a wave of terror swept through the city as the NKVD rounded up the usual suspects, often targeting individuals simply because they had a foreign-sounding last name. On September 7th, the German 20th Motorized Division moved north from Mega to seize the Signavino Heights. The following day, bolstered by part of the 12th Panzer Division, it reached the town of Schlisselburg, which featured a Tsarist fortress situated at the southwestern edge of Lake Ladoga, where the Neva River flows into it. Leningrad was now completely isolated by land. The only remaining escape route was across the vast lake. It took Voroshilov and Zhdanov an entire day to muster the courage to inform Stalin that the Germans had captured Schlisselburg. The siege of Leningrad, the longest and most merciless in modern history, had begun. Alongside 500,000 soldiers, the civilian population of Leningrad numbered over 2.5 million, including 400,000 children. The headquarters of the German Führer determined it did not wish to occupy the city. Instead, they aimed to bombard it and cut it off, allowing its citizens to starve and succumb to disease. Once weakened, the city would be destroyed and the area would be turned over to Finland. Stalin had already made up his mind to implement a change in leadership in Leningrad. He ordered Zhukov to take command, relying on his ruthless reputation. Zhukov departed Moscow immediately after receiving his orders. Upon his arrival, he went straight to the military council at the Smolny Institute, where he claimed to have encountered defeatism and excessive drinking. He quickly escalated the threats beyond Stalin's own, declaring to the commanders of the Leningrad front, "Make it clear to all troops that any families of those who surrender to the enemy will be shot, and those individuals will face execution upon their return from captivity." Clearly, Georgy Zhukov did not understand that following his order to the letter would have resulted in the execution of Joseph Stalin himself. The Soviet leader's own son, Lieutenant Yakov Djugashvili, had been captured during an encirclement. In private, Stalin remarked that it would have been better if his son had never been born. The Nazi propaganda machine quickly exploited their captured prize. A soldier named Vasily Churkin noted in his diary, "On a sunny day, we saw a large pile of leaflets fall from a German aircraft. They featured a photograph of Stalin's son, flanked by smiling German officers. It was orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels and was ineffective." Stalin's ruthless attitude toward his son only softened in 1945, when it was reported that Yakov had thrown himself against the barbed wire in his camp, forcing the guards to shoot him. Stalin had no compassion for civilians. Upon learning that the Germans were pushing old men and women, mothers and children to the front as human shields or as messengers demanding surrender, he ordered that they should be shot. My response is, no sentimentality. Instead, crush the enemy and his collaborators, regardless of their condition. War is unforgiving, and those who show weakness will be the first to face defeat. A Gefreiter with the 269th Infantry Division wrote on September 21st, "Crowds of civilians are escaping from the siege, and one has to turn a blind eye to avoid witnessing their suffering." Even at the front, where exchanges of fire are fierce, many children and women are present. When a shell whizzes nearby, they scramble for cover. It seems amusing, and we laugh at it, but it is genuinely heartbreaking. As the last of the wounded and defeated made their way back into the city, authorities attempted to impose strict control, with NKVD troops ready to shoot any deserter or defeatist on sight. The paranoia of the Stalinist regime grew, prompting orders to the NKVD to arrest 29 categories of suspected enemies. The city's spy hysteria became intense, fueled by wild rumors, largely due to the scant information released by the Soviet authorities. While a small number of residents in Leningrad wish for the downfall of the Stalinist regime, there is no indication of organized German or Finnish intelligence activities at play. Zhukov ordered the guns of the Baltic Fleet at Kronstadt to be used, either as floating batteries or disassembled and moved to the Pulkovo Heights near Leningrad to return fire on enemy artillery positions. General of Artillery Nikolai Voronov directed the fire from the dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral. The large gilded dome, visible from Finland, was quickly camouflaged with gray paint. On September 8th, the day the Germans captured Schlisselburg, Luftwaffe bombers targeted food storage sites in the southern part of the city. Churkin noted in his diary with shock, "Columns of thick smoke are rising high. It's the Bataevsky food depots burning. Fire is consuming the 6-month food supplies for the entire population of Leningrad." The failure to relocate the supplies was a significant mistake. Rations would need to be cut drastically. Moreover, little effort was made to stockpile firewood for the winter. The most serious error, however, was not evacuating more civilians. Aside from refugees, fewer than 500,000 residents of Leningrad were sent east before the German advance severed the escape routes. In the latter half of September, the Germans launched intense attacks along with heavy air raids. Soviet pilots, flying outdated aircraft, found themselves ramming German bombers again. The defenders, largely due to their artillery support, managed to repel the ground assaults. Marine infantry from the Red Banner Baltic Fleet were instrumental, donning their midnight blue sailor hats at a stylish angle with a proud forelock as their trademark. On September 24th, General Feldmarschall von Lieb conceded that he lacked the forces to break through. This coincided with increasing pressure from other German commanders to restart the push toward Moscow. Hoth's Panzer Group was reassigned to Army Group Center. As winter approached, bringing colder nighttime temperatures, both sides became defensive, leading to trench warfare. By the end of the month, the fiercely contested front devolved into sporadic artillery exchanges. Soviet losses in the north had been catastrophic, with 214,078 irrecoverable losses, representing between a third and half of all troops deployed. Yet, this would pale in comparison to the mass fatalities caused by starvation that lay ahead. Even if Leningrad fell, Hitler had no plans to occupy the city or to feed its citizens. He wanted both of them entirely wiped from existence. German soldiers, who had been appalled by the suffering in Polish villages in 1939, felt even greater revulsion on Soviet soil. The brutal slayings of prisoners by the NKVD and the harsh conditions of collective farms deepened their biases against what Goebbels mockingly called the Soviet paradise. The Nazi propaganda minister, with his malevolent brilliance, understood that mere contempt and hatred were insufficient. He realized that a combination of hatred and fear was the most potent way to foster a mindset of extermination. His terms, Asiatic, treacherous, Jewish Bolshevik, bestial, and subhuman, served this purpose. Many soldiers were persuaded by Hitler's assertion that the Jews were responsible for the war. The primitive and fearful fascination that many Germans held for Eastern Slavs was certainly amplified by shocking accounts of brutality during the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Nazi propaganda aimed to highlight a cultural clash between German order and Bolshevik chaos, filth, and atheism. Yet despite superficial similarities between the Nazi and Soviet systems, the ideological and cultural chasm between the two nations was immense, stretching from the significant to the mundane. During the summer heat, German motorcyclists often rode around in little more than shorts and goggles. In Belarus and Ukraine, elderly women were taken aback by their exposed skin. They were even more startled when German soldiers walked around without clothes in their peasant homes and harassed young women. Although there seemed to be relatively few instances of outright rape by German soldiers stationed in villages near the front, many more incidents occurred further back, particularly against young Jewish women. The most heinous crimes occurred with official sanction. Young women from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were gathered and forced into military brothels, subjected to continuous sexual assault by off-duty soldiers. If they resisted, they faced brutal punishment and even execution. Despite Nazi laws prohibiting sexual relations with what they deemed subhumans, military leaders viewed this system as a practical solution, aimed at maintaining discipline and the health of their soldiers. The young women could at least be regularly checked for infectious diseases by Wehrmacht doctors. However, German soldiers also felt sympathy for Soviet women who were left behind during the retreat and had to fend for themselves without men, animals, or machinery. One signals corporal wrote in a letter home, describing how he witnessed women pulling a makeshift plow, while another directed its use. He noted a group of women repairing the road under the supervision of a man from Organization Tut, emphasizing the use of punishment to enforce compliance. There was hardly a family where the man was not deceased, and in 90% of cases, the answer to inquiries was the same: husband dead in war. It was horrifying, and the loss of men in Russia was immense. Many Soviet citizens, particularly those from Ukraine, had not anticipated the horrors of the German occupation. In Ukraine, numerous villagers initially welcomed the German troops with the customary offering of bread and salt. After Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of farms and the catastrophic famine of 1932 to 1933 that claimed the lives of approximately 3,300,000 people, animosity towards the communists was widespread. Older, more religious Ukrainians were misled by the black crosses displayed on the German armored vehicles, believing they symbolized a crusade against irreligious Bolshevism. Abwehr officers recognized that, given the vast territories to conquer, the most effective strategy for the Wehrmacht would be to form a Ukrainian army of 1 million soldiers. However, Hitler rejected this proposal, unwilling to arm what he viewed as Slavic subhumans, though his orders were soon disregarded by both the army and the SS, which began to recruit nonetheless. Conversely, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, who had supported the Germans prior to the invasion, faced suppression as Berlin aimed to extinguish their aspirations for an independent Ukraine. Following all the Soviet propaganda about its industrial achievements, Ukrainians and others were astonished by the quality and diversity of German equipment. Vasily Grossman depicted villagers gathering around a captured Austrian motorcyclist, where everyone admired his long, soft, steel-colored leather coat. They were left in disbelief, questioning how they could contend with an enemy that wore such fine attire, imagining their aircraft must be equally impressive. In correspondence back home, German soldiers expressed dissatisfaction, noting that there was little of value to steal in the Soviet Union, aside from food. Disregarding the early provisions, they took geese, chickens, and other livestock. They destroyed hives for honey, ignoring the desperate cries of their victims who pleaded that without supplies, they would not survive the winter. The soldier reminisced about the campaign in France, which had provided ample resources. Unlike the French, the soldiers of the Red Army continued to fight, refusing to accept defeat. Any German soldier who showed sympathy for the suffering of Soviet captives was mocked by his peers. The vast majority viewed the hundreds of thousands of prisoners as little more than pests. Their tragic state, filthy from their treatment, only reinforced the prejudices shaped by years of propaganda. Victims were thus stripped of their humanity in a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy. One soldier guarding a group of Soviet prisoners wrote to his family that they were eating grass like cattle. When they passed a potato field, they fell to the ground, digging with their fingers and eating raw potatoes. Even though the central strategy of Operation Barbarossa involved encirclement battles, German military leaders had intentionally done little to prepare for the large number of prisoners. The more that perished from neglect, the fewer there would be to sustain. A French prisoner described the arrival of a group of Soviet detainees at a Wehrmacht camp. The Russians came in rows of 5, holding on to each other, as none could walk unaided. Walking skeletons was truly the only appropriate term. Their faces were not just yellow, they appeared green. Almost all squinted, lacking the strength to focus their sight. They collapsed in groups of 5. The Germans rushed at them and struck them with rifle butts and whips. German officers later attempted to explain the treatment of the 3 million prisoners taken by October as a result of insufficient troops for guarding them and a lack of transport for feeding them. Yet thousands of Red Army captives died during forced marches simply because the Wehrmacht did not want their vehicles or trains exposed to the foul-smelling masses. No camps were established, so they were corralled in their tens of thousands into barbed wire enclosures without any shelter. Little food or water was provided. This was part of the Nazis' hunger plan, aimed at exterminating 30 million Soviet citizens to address what they perceived as overpopulation in the occupied areas. Wounded individuals were left under the care of Red Army doctors, but without any medical supplies. German guards would throw meager amounts of bread over the barbed wire, deriving entertainment from watching men fight over it. In 1941 alone, over 2 million Soviet prisoners perished from starvation, disease, and exposure. In retaliation, Soviet troops shot and bayoneted prisoners out of rage, a reaction stemming from the shock of the invasion and the brutality of German tactics. The chaos of retreat made it nearly impossible to feed and guard captives, resulting in few being spared. Senior commanders were frustrated by the loss of potential interrogations from these prisoners. The mix of fear and animosity significantly contributed to the brutality of the war against partisans. Traditional German military strategy had already fostered a deep resentment towards guerrilla warfare long before the High Command issued orders to execute commissars and partisans. Even before Joseph Stalin urged for insurrection behind German lines in his speech on July 3, 1941, spontaneous resistance had begun with groups of bypassed Red Army soldiers. Partisan bands formed in forests and marshes, bolstered by civilians escaping persecution and the destruction of their homes. Utilizing the skills of fieldcraft and camouflage that came naturally to those with rural backgrounds, Soviet partisans quickly became a more substantial threat than the planners of Operation Barbarossa had anticipated. By early September 1941, 63 partisan units comprising nearly 5,000 men and women were active behind German lines in Ukraine alone. The NKVD was also preparing to deploy another 80 groups, along with an additional 434 detachments being trained as stay-behind units. In total, more than 20,000 partisans were either already active or being readied. Some were specially trained assassins capable of posing as German officers. They targeted railway lines, rolling stock, locomotives, troop trains, supply trucks, motorcycle couriers, bridges, fuel and ammunition depots, as well as landlines, telegraphs, and airfields. Partisan detachments, led primarily by officers from the NKVD frontier forces, used parachute radios to send intelligence back to Moscow and to receive new instructions. This partisan campaign made the prospect of colonizing Adolf Hitler's so-called Garden of Eden significantly less appealing to potential German and Volksdeutsch settlers who had been promised farmland in that region. The entire Lebensraum plan in the east depended on cleansed territories and an entirely submissive peasantry. It was expected that Nazi reprisals would grow increasingly brutal. Villages that experienced partisan attacks were often set ablaze. Hostages faced execution, and glaring forms of punishment included the public hanging of young women and girls accused of assisting the partisans. Yet as the brutality grew, so did the resolve to resist. In many instances, Soviet partisan leaders intentionally incited German reprisals to fuel hatred toward the invader. It truly was a time marked by iron. The value of an individual's life seemed to diminish on both sides, particularly in the eyes of Germans when the individual was Jewish. The Holocaust can essentially be divided into two phases, which Vasily Grossman later referred to as the Shoah by bullets and the Shoah by gas. The evolution of the systematic murder that occurred in death camps was, to say the least, inconsistent. Until September 1939, the Nazis aimed to drive German, Austrian, and Czech Jews to emigrate by inflicting maltreatment, humiliation, and seizing their property. However, once the war commenced, this approach became increasingly challenging. The conquest of Poland brought an additional 1.7 million Jews under Nazi control. In May 1940, during the invasion of France, Heinrich Himmler wrote a memorandum for Hitler titled "Some Thoughts on the Treatment of Alien Populations in the East." He proposed evaluating the Polish populace so that those deemed racially valuable could be Germanized while the remainder would be converted into slave labor. Regarding the Jews, he noted, "I hope completely to erase the concept of Jews through the possibility of a great emigration to a colony in Africa or elsewhere." At that point, Himmler viewed genocide, described as the Bolshevik method of physical extermination, as un-German and impossible. Himmler's vision for relocating European Jews focused on the French island of Madagascar. Meanwhile, Adolf Eichmann, still a junior official, considered Palestine, which was a British mandate. Reinhard Heydrich, who served as Himmler's deputy, also contended that the Jewish issue needed a solution. 75 million Jews in German-occupied regions could not find resolution through emigration, necessitating a territorial solution. The challenge was that even if Vichy France consented, the Madagascar project was unfeasible given British naval dominance. Still, the concept of relocating Jews to a designated area persisted as the favored strategy. In March 1941, with Polish ghettos overcrowded, mass sterilization was considered. Subsequently, as Hitler prepared for Operation Barbarossa, senior Nazis began to champion the removal of Europe's Jews, alongside 31 million Slavs, to an area deep in the Soviet Union after achieving victory. This would occur when German forces reached the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line, at which point the Luftwaffe could shift to long-range bombing of remaining Soviet arms factories and communication hubs in the Urals and beyond. For Hans Frank, the regent of the general government, the invasion provided the chance to deport all Jews who had been forced into his area. Others, such as Reinhard Heydrich, focused on more urgent matters, particularly the pacification of the conquered lands. Hitler's idea of pacification was unmistakable. He told Alfred Rosenberg, the Minister for Eastern Territories, that it would be most effective by executing anyone who dared to give them a sideways glance. Soldiers were to avoid prosecution for crimes against civilians unless absolutely necessary for maintaining discipline. Army commanders, now fully under Hitler's influence following their unexpected success over France, did not raise concerns. Many embraced the notion of a war of annihilation. any lingering outrage over the SS's lethal actions in Poland had faded. General Feldmarschall von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief, collaborated closely with Heydrich to coordinate between the army and the SS during Barbarossa. The German army would support the Einsatzgruppen, coordinating with them through the senior intelligence officer at each army's headquarters. Therefore, at the level of army command and senior staff, no one could feign ignorance about their actions. The Shoah by bullets is generally associated with the 3,000 members of the SS Einsatzgruppen. Consequently, the massacres executed by the 11,000 personnel in 21 battalions of Ordnungspolizei, acting as a secondary force behind the advancing armies, have often been overlooked. Heinrich Himmler also gathered an SS cavalry brigade along with 2 additional Waffen-SS brigades to be prepared for assistance. The commander of the 1st SS Cavalry Regiment was Hermann Fegelein, who in 1944 married the sister of Eva Braun, thereby entering the inner circle of Adolf Hitler. Himmler directed his SS cavalry to carry out the execution of all male Jews and force their women into the wetlands of the Pripyat marshes. By mid-August 1941, the cavalry brigade claimed to have killed 200 Russians in active combat and shot 13,788 civilians, most of whom were Jews labeled as plunderers. Each of the 3 army groups involved in the invasion was accompanied by an Einsatzgruppe. A 4th group would later be established in the south along the Black Sea coast, following the Romanians and the 11th Army. The personnel for the Einsatzgruppen were drawn from various branches of Himmler's domain, including the Waffen-SS, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Sicherheitspolizei, the Kriminalpolizei, and the Ordnungspolizei. Each Einsatzgruppe, consisting of around 800 men, included 2 Sonderkommandos operating closely behind the troops and 2 Einsatzkommandos positioned slightly further back. Reinhard Heydrich instructed the Einsatzgruppen commanders, many of whom came from the intellectual elite of the SS and held doctorates, to motivate local anti-Semitic factions to kill Jews and communists. These operations were referred to as self-cleansing efforts, but it was made clear that they should not imply official German endorsement or give these groups the impression that their actions might lead to any form of political autonomy. The Einsatzgruppen were tasked with executing Communist Party officials, commissars, partisans, saboteurs, and Jews in positions within the party and state. Heydrich presumably also suggested that they could extend their actions beyond these categories when fulfilling their roles with unprecedented harshness, including shooting male Jews of military age. However, there appears to have been no official directive at this point encouraging the murder of Jewish women and children. The killing of Jewish males commenced immediately after the German forces entered Soviet territory on June 22nd. Many of the initial massacres were carried out by Lithuanian and Ukrainian anti-Semites, as Heydrich had anticipated. In western Ukraine, 24,000 Jews were killed, while in Kaunas, 3,800 were slaughtered. Sometimes, Jews were gathered and tormented in the presence of German soldiers, with rabbis having their beards pulled or set ablaze. They were then brutally killed amid the cheers of the crowd. The Germans promoted the notion that these murders were vengeance for the killings conducted by the NKVD before its withdrawal. Einsatzgruppen and police battalions began to gather and execute Jews in large numbers, sometimes in the hundreds or even thousands. The victims were forced to dig their own mass graves. Those who did not dig quickly enough faced execution. Afterward, they were compelled to strip, partly so their clothes could be reused, but also to check for any hidden valuables or money. Kneeling at the edge of the pit, they were shot in the back of the head, causing their bodies to roll forward into the grave. Some SS and police units preferred a different method, making their victims lie in a straight line along the trench's bottom and shooting them in place with submachine guns. The next group was then made to lie on top of the fallen, head to toe, and they too would be shot. This became known as the sardine method. In a few instances, Jews were herded into a synagogue, which was then set ablaze, and those trying to escape were shot down. With Heinrich Himmler's frequent visits to boost morale among his men, the slaughter escalated uncontrollably. Initially targeting Jews in party and state positions, the scope quickly broadened to include all Jewish men of military age and ultimately all Jewish men without regard to age. During late June and early July, local anti-Semitic groups primarily executed Jewish women and children. However, by the end of July, the SS Einsatzgruppen, Himmler's Waffen-SS brigades, and police battalions had also begun regularly killing women and children. They were aided, despite Adolf Hitler's orders not to arm Slavs, by 26 locally recruited police battalions, many of whom were drawn by the opportunity to plunder. Ordinary German soldiers and even Luftwaffe personnel participated in these killings, as revealed by interrogators from the NKVD 7th Department, who later questioned German prisoners. One pilot from the 3rd Air Squadron recounted taking part in the execution of a group of Jews in a village near Berdichev at the war's outset, carried out as punishment for reporting a German pilot to the Red Army. A Gefreiter from the 765th Pioneer Battalion, named Traxler, witnessed the execution of Jews by SS soldiers near Rovno and Dubno. When a soldier commented on the horrific scene, an Unteroffizier named Graf from the same unit remarked that seeing the Jews as lesser beings and removing them proved one's civilization. One day, a German transport Gefreiter, along with his company clerk, witnessed men, women, and children whose hands were bound with wire being herded along the road by SS officers. Curious about the commotion, they went to investigate. Outside a village, they discovered a trench, approximately 150 meters long and 3 meters deep, where hundreds of Jews had been collected. The victims were compelled to lie in the trench in rows, allowing an SS officer on each side to walk along and execute them with captured Soviet submachine guns. Following this, more individuals were forced forward to lie atop the bodies of the deceased. It was then that a young girl, likely no older than 12, cried out in a high-pitched, desperate voice, pleading for her life. The child was seized, thrown into the ditch, and shot. A few individuals managed to escape these horrors, though understandably, they were left deeply traumatized by what they had witnessed. In the northeastern part of Ukraine, Vasily Grossman came across one of these survivors. He described a girl, a striking Jewish beauty who had evaded capture, noting her eyes, which appeared wild and filled with madness, in his notebook. Younger officers in the German army appeared to accept the killing of Jewish children more readily than their older counterparts, largely due to a belief that those spared might seek vengeance in the future. In September of 1944, a conversation between General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach and his son, serving in the Kriegsmarine, was secretly recorded while they were held captive by the British. General Eberbach stated that killing the million Jews, or however many there were, was justifiable for the good of their people, but he felt that slaying women and children was unnecessary and excessive. His son countered that if they were to exterminate the Jews, all should be included, suggesting that killing the elderly served no purpose. Generally, frontline troops did not take part in these massacres, although there were notable exceptions, particularly the SS Viking Division in Ukraine and some infantry divisions involved in killings like those in Brest-Litovsk. It is undeniable that there was a close collaboration between the SS and Army Group headquarters. However, senior Army officers sought to distance themselves from the ongoing events. Orders were issued to prevent members of the Wehrmacht from participating in or witnessing mass killings, yet more off-duty soldiers began to appear, watching and photographing the atrocities. Some even volunteered to step in when the executioners needed a break. The mass killings spread beyond Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarusia, reaching Ukraine, often with the help of local men recruited as auxiliaries. Anti-Semitism surged during the Great Ukrainian Famine as Soviet agents spread rumors blaming Jews for the starvation to deflect accountability from Stalin's policies of collectivization and dekulakization. Ukrainian volunteers were also assigned to guard Red Army prisoners. One Gefreiter noted, "They are willing and comradely. They proved to be a significant relief for their ranks." After the mass killings in Lwów and other cities, Ukrainians assisted by denouncing and rounding up the victims of Einsatzgruppe C in Berdichev, which had one of the highest concentrations of Jews. When German forces entered the city, soldiers shouted, "Jude kaput," from their trucks, waving their arms, as later revealed by Vasily Grossman. Over 20,000 Jews were executed in batches near the airstrip, including Grossman's mother. He would be haunted by guilt for not bringing her to Moscow at the onset of the German invasion. A Jewish woman named Ida Belozovskaya recounted the scene when Germans arrived in her town near Kiev on September 19th. People with eager, happy, submissive faces lined the road, greeting their liberators. On that day, I understood that our lives were nearing an end, that our suffering was beginning. We were all trapped. There was nowhere to run. Jews were denounced not only out of anti-Semitism, but also from fear, as Belozovskaya explained. The Germans would execute any family found harboring Jews, causing even those who might sympathize and wish to help to refrain from providing shelter. While the Hungarian army associated with Rundstedt's Army Group South did not engage in mass killings, the Romanian forces attacking Odessa, which had a significant Jewish population, committed horrendous acts. In the summer of 1941, it was reported that Romanian soldiers killed around 10,000 Jews while reclaiming areas in Bessarabia and Bukovina. Even German officers considered their allies' actions to be disorganized and excessively brutal. In Odessa, the Romanians executed 35,000 individuals. The German Sixth Army, led by Generalfeldmarschall von, a staunch Nazi, included the 1st SS Brigade as part of its forces. An army security unit, the Feldgendarmerie, along with other military divisions, also participated in the mass murders throughout the campaign. On September 27th, shortly after capturing Kiev, Reichenau attended a meeting with the town commandant and SS officers from Sonderkommando 4A. They decided that the commandant would post notices instructing the Jewish population to assemble for evacuation, requiring them to bring their identification documents, money, valuables, and warm clothing. The Nazis' horrific plans were inadvertently aided by a consequence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalinist censorship had suppressed any indication of Hitler's extreme anti-Semitism. Consequently, when the Jews in Kiev were ordered to report for resettlement, an astonishing 33,771 complied. The Sixth Army, which was facilitating transportation, expected only about 7,000 to show up. It took the SS Sonderkommando 3 days to execute all of them in the ravine of Babi Yar, located outside the city. Ida Belozovskaya, married to a Gentile, recounted the gathering of Jews in Kiev, including her own relatives. On September 28th, her husband and his Russian sister went to bid farewell to her loved ones on their final journey. They believed, as did many, that the German forces would simply relocate them somewhere safe, and for several days, people continued to move in large groups toward what they thought was salvation. The Germans did not rush to process everyone, directing people to return the next day. Yet, individuals kept arriving day after day until their moment to depart this world eventually came. Her Russian husband followed one of the transports to Babi Yar to see what was happening. He glimpsed through a small opening in the tall fence. The people were divided, with men directed to one side and women and children to the other. Stripped of their clothing, they fell victim to submachine guns and machine guns, the sound of gunfire drowning out their screams and cries. It is estimated that over 1.5 million Soviet Jews managed to flee from the killing squads. However, the concentration of most of the Jewish population in the western parts of the Soviet Union, particularly in cities and large towns, facilitated the operations of the Einsatzgruppen. The commanders of these groups were often surprised by the level of cooperation they received from the army. By the end of 1942, it is estimated that the total number of Jews murdered by the SS Einsatzgruppen, Ordnungspolizei, anti-partisan units, and the German army had surpassed 1,350,000 individuals. The use of gas for mass executions developed in a disorganized manner. As early as 1935, Adolf Hitler had suggested that once war began, he would implement a euthanasia program. This program included those deemed criminally insane, the intellectually disabled, incapacitated individuals, and children born with defects, all categorized by the Nazis as having lives unworthy of life. The first euthanasia was performed on July 25, 1939, by Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt, whom the leader tasked with establishing an advisory committee. Less than 2 weeks before the invasion of Poland, the Ministry of the Interior instructed hospitals to report all cases of deformed newborns. This reporting requirement was soon expanded to include adults. The first mental patients executed occurred in Poland 3 weeks after the invasion, where they were shot in a nearby forest. Follow-up massacres of other asylum inmates occurred rapidly, resulting in the deaths of over 20,000 individuals in this manner. German patients from Pomerania were similarly executed. 2 of the hospitals that were cleared out became barracks for the Waffen-SS. By late November, gas chambers utilizing carbon monoxide were operational, and Heinrich Himmler observed one of these killings in December. Early in 1940, experiments were conducted using sealed trucks as mobile gas chambers, which were considered successful because they simplified the transportation of patients. The organizer received a promise of 10 Reichsmark for each individual. This system, directed from Berlin, expanded throughout the Reich under the name T4. Parents were convinced that their disabled children, some of whom had only learning difficulties, could be better looked after at another facility. They were later informed that their child had succumbed to pneumonia. By August 1941, around 70,000 German adults and children had been killed in gas chambers. This number included German Jews who had been in hospitals for a considerable period. The overwhelming number of victims and the dubious death certificates could not keep the euthanasia program a secret. Hitler issued an order to stop it that August after church leaders, led by Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen, condemned it. However, a secret version continued afterward, resulting in the deaths of another 20,000 by the end of the war. Those involved in the euthanasia program were later recruited for the death camps in eastern Poland in 1942. Historians have pointed out that the Nazis' euthanasia program not only laid the groundwork for the final solution, but also for their vision of a racially and genetically pure society. Due to Hitler's tendency to avoid documenting controversial decisions, historians have interpreted the vague and often euphemistic language found in subsidiary documents differently when trying to pinpoint when the decision to initiate the final solution was made. This task has proven to be exceedingly challenging, especially since the movement toward genocide involved unrecorded encouragement from leadership, along with a disorganized series of actions and experiments conducted by various killing groups. Interestingly, it resembled the Auftragstaktik of the army, where a general directive was put into action by the on-site commander. Some historians reasonably argue that the fundamental decision for outright genocide occurred in July or August 1941, when a swift victory still seemed achievable for the German army. Others believe it did not occur until the fall, when the German advance in the Soviet Union noticeably slowed, making a territorial solution seem increasingly unfeasible. Some even suggest it was determined later, in the second week of December, when the German army was stalled outside Moscow and Hitler declared war on the United States. The fact that each Einsatzgruppe interpreted its mission in slightly different ways indicates that there was no centrally communicated order. In August, total genocide became routine, with Jewish women and children also being killed in large numbers. On August 15th, Heinrich Himmler witnessed an execution of 100 Jews near Minsk for the first time, a spectacle arranged at his request by Einsatzgruppe B. Himmler found it unbearable to watch. Afterward, Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zaleski emphasized that only 100 had been shot that day. He remarked to Himmler about the profound impact on the men in this unit, stating, "Look at their eyes, they are deeply shaken. These men are finished for life. What kind of followers are we training here? Either neurotics or savages." Bach-Zaleski himself experienced nightmares and stomach pain as a result, leading to hospitalization under Himmler's orders, where he was treated by the chief physician of the SS. Himmler spoke to the men, defending their actions and informing them that Adolf Hitler had ordered the elimination of all Jews in the Eastern Territories, likening their task to eradicating pests like bedbugs and rats. That afternoon, he consulted with Arthur Nabe, the commander of Einsatzgruppe, and Bach-Zaleski about alternatives to shooting. Nabe proposed an experiment using explosives, which Himmler approved, but it turned out to be a crude and embarrassing failure. The next approach involved gas vans that used carbon monoxide from exhaust fumes. Himmler sought a method he considered more humane for the executioners, expressing concern for their psychological well-being and encouraging social events in the evenings with sing-alongs. However, most of the killers preferred to drown their sorrows in alcohol. The ramping up of the mass murder of Jews also coincided with the increasingly brutal treatment and execution of Soviet prisoners of war by the Wehrmacht. On September 3rd, Zyklon B, an insecticide developed by the chemical company IG Farben, was used for the first time at Auschwitz-Birkenau in tests involving Soviet and Polish prisoners. Concurrently, Jews from Germany and Western Europe being transported to the Eastern Territories were murdered upon arrival by police officials who insisted that this was the only way to handle the overwhelming numbers. High-ranking officials in the German-occupied Eastern Territories, including the Reichskommissariat Ostland, which covered the Baltic states and part of Belarusia, and the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, were left in the dark regarding the policy. This would only become evident after the Wannsee Conference in January of the following year.